There was a revival on campus that was basically student-led. I can't recall any faculty actually being involved. But there were several things that were catalytic, I think, to the atmosphere on campus that made it possible or set the stage for this experience. One was that there was a great deal of social unrest. It was Vietnam War. I think the draft had been initiated. I can picture it in my mind. The evening the draft was announced on television, where a lot of our friends and boyfriends and people that we knew had a low number, so they just went and signed up and went to Vietnam, and that was a real life impacting experience, because you read about it in the news, you saw things happening, but then it got real when your roommate or somebody else was drafted and gone. So that was one catalytic thing. Another thing that was early in the fall, I think at early October, we had a student spiritual life retreat up Camp Casey, and I remember that as being just an electric experience. There were about 60 of us, I think, something like that. And one highlight for me was we had an evening after dark where we went and worshiped in one of those bunkers up on the hill, and we had torches, kerosene torch. I mean, it was like the first century Christians going out to worship in the catacombs or something, and I came away just with a visceral feeling that God's presence had been with us. The third thing that was significant was that there was a movement of God in Asbury College the previous spring, and they started sending teams of students out to different campuses, and we were the recipients of one of those. Actually, a chapel experience. I think it was mid-October when this occurred, and basically they just shared their story, and as a response there were people lining up to make confession before the whole student body. There were lines on both sides of what now is McKinley Auditorium. It was, at that time, it was where we had required chapel every day, and so this continued for well past the hour that it was scheduled for. And I remember going. I was the student co-chair of the religious affairs on the campus at that time, and so I talked to some of my friends, and I said, what do we do with this? And so I went up and we made arrangements to have the whole student body move up to Gwynn Commons and share communion. And so at the conclusion of when the chapel was over, I think it took about 2.5 hours, and then we went up to Gwynn as a group and shared communion, where the sharing continued. I don't think they even served the noon meal. I think everything was continuous from that point. And it was just an amazing experience that we knew that God had visited us. The follow-up to that was that we arranged to have volunteers that would lead prayer groups in each of the dormitories, and I know that fairly spontaneously there were also small groups on each of the floors that I didn't know about who they all were, but there was one on our floor, and people knew about it, and so there was a prayer presence that continued kind of underground, actually, because it wasn't scheduled or announced or it was just a word of mouth kind of thing, and people joined them as they would. I think that effect continued to influence the campus life for the whole year. I don't know about beyond that, because I graduated and went off and did other things, but I know that there was, for that window of time, about 6 months, there was just a feeling of anticipation, and the way people related to each other, and seemed to be a kindness on campus that was an interesting atmosphere. I remember thinking when the shooting occurred over here that when a large community is in crisis, often that's a fluid opportunity for God's Spirit to work, and for people to seek change and to find answers, and to ask God what's up. And so those were all parts of I believe what were true during that time. And that's about where my memory ends. Yeah. Do you have questions?
Jim, I
That's the introduction.
heard that classes were canceled. Is that
For the day,
for the day?
they were. Yeah,
Okay.
that particular day. I think it was a Tuesday. It was early in the week. Yeah.
You mentioned a sense of kindness on campus. Were there any other tangible results of that in people's lives that you could see? What the end result of all
Yeah.
that?
I think just a general awareness that God had come and we should respond to it somehow. Like I say, it really wasn't an organized movement. It was just students interacting with each other. It was it was one of the benchmark, maybe the benchmark time of my college experience that left the impression that I've been around the campus here. My dad used to work here since I was 10 years old, so I've got a lot of history. In fact, our home was where the Emerson Street Lounge is right now. We lived there for quite a while. Wow. So I've had an interest and observed, the campus over quite a few years, and that was one of the periods of time where I felt that God's presence was really effective. People weren't just here for a college education. I think they were here, experiencing community, and certainly those who didn't know God, knew that something was up, and that it was left an impression for them as well. So.
How many people here have seen the video of the Asbury Revival? So, almost everyone. Okay, email me and I can send you the link. If you haven't seen it, it's obligatory viewing. The president of Asbury College gives a talk about it.
Okay.
His reflections on it, and it was very moving.
Another thing that I recall, there were gospel teams that were organized on campus, and they would go out and minister in the community, and they would tell the story. And I didn't hear a lot of personal stories about that, but I know that there were quite a number that when the choir traveled, they took the story with them to the venues that they visited, and so there was an outreach as well that went other places from the campus.
Did those groups start after that time, or had they already been operating?
No, those were part of the structure of the student life.
Because I came to campus the next year as a student,
okay.
and I remember those groups
Yeah.
going out, and there were quite a number of small groups that would go out to different places.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How were faculty and staff impacted on this? I know it was student-led. Did you remember what the rest of the campus was experiencing through the students?
I don't remember having any interaction with the faculty on that level. I just remember all the encounters that I was a part of. There weren't any faculty there, and so I'm sure they were praying for it and aware of what was going on. But and I'm sure that when no students showed up in their classes, they probably, yeah, they were alerted about that. But,
Bill and Dawn would have been there.
who's that?
Well, we have faculty here who would have been Bill,
Yeah.
Bill, Dawn, Jael, Gloria.
Well, Bob Drovedal
Yeah,
was
Yeah,
here.
Bob, yeah.
I'm just
Uh,
saying they would have participated.
There
if
has-
they'd been there.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah.
Jim, I kind of missed, so what was the connection between what happened at Asbury College?
Yes.
And
Asbury.
and SPU?
They started sending out gospel teams
Mm.
that they just shared the story.
Mm.
They told about God's movement and how it affected their lives and how it was just a spontaneous move of the Spirit and involved an invitation to the Holy Spirit to do whatever He wanted to do.
Mhm.
And then the core activity was basically confession.
Mm.
You know, the people's hearts were moved, and they shared some incredibly deep things about their own personal lives and about their desire to change. And I mean, these were, I don't know, I wouldn't guess a number, except there were dozens and dozens. I mean, the lines were continuous for the mic
Are you
for
talking
2
about
hours.
There or here? Or
Pardon?
both?
Pardon me?
Are you talking about what happened there?
I'm
or
talking about
here?
what happened here.
Oh.
And when their students initiated in the chapel program,
Mhm.
just told what God was doing at Asbury,
Mhm.
and then just opened the floor and invited people
Mhm.
to share their hearts. I mean, it was a flood.
Mm.
Did they start by sharing public repentance, the people from Asbury here? Because I know they did there, but did they kind of lead that here, or did that happen spontaneously? Does that
You know,
question make sense?
Yes, it does. But I'm trying to recollect. I don't think they really gave instructions. I think they shared their story.
Mhm.
And I think there were people that were already ready to jump in. And once the finger was taken out of the dike, it was a flood. It kind of happened by itself.
Well, I have a good friend, as of now, who was a student at that time. And his life was transformed through that. It totally turned him around.
Mhm.
From a nominal Christian to a dedicated follower of Jesus. And it's still today. It's true in his life. So it was a big deal for him too.
Yeah. I remember being part of a small group prayer, probably one of the most dynamic prayer groups that I've ever been a part of. Just on our floor. On the weekend, guys, instead of going out, they, hey, we're going to be in the room,
Wow. This was after the
This was, yeah,
chapel?
yeah.
Mhm.
And what made it, tell us about it. What does a dynamic prayer meeting look like?
Well, dynamic prayer, there's a sense of anticipation.
Mhm.
There's a waiting for something to happen, not to make it happen.
Mhm.
Once we started praying, it seemed like there was no sense of time. It could go on for 2 hours, or we'd be surprised how long we were there together. And I remember the particular group I was part of was from a variety of denominations. It kind of surprised me how much we had in common when the Spirit kind of,
That was a bigger deal back then.
yeah.
I mean, some young people don't remember that it used to be that Catholics wouldn't marry Methodists, or Methodists wouldn't even marry Presbyterians. I mean, this is not that long ago that denominations were a big deal.
Right. Well, I was a Free Methodist, and we were in the minority. There were mostly Baptists on campus at that time, and then probably more Pentecostals than Free Methodists. But it was didn't matter.
Yeah.
What was the mix of, sorry, what was the mix of, like, were majority of students considered Christians, or, I don't know, at that time?
I think at that time, I wouldn't guess a percentage, but I would say that if you interacted with, most of the students I knew had some kind of profession of faith.
Mm.
So I would probably think that it was fairly high. We weren't nearly as ethnically integrated as we are now.
Mhm.
And also the international students that we have now that bring their cultural richness and experiences to us, that was fairly uncommon. So, yeah.
I actually have to go to class, but I do really wanted to connect and to pray for the school, if that's okay. And I don't know how I can connect with you guys. Is there like somebody who organizes or?